If you stay with me for the next few minutes, you're going to hear how a quiet life built on wildflowers, wood smoke, and morning dew turned into the most terrifying day of my life. Because the moment my wife collapsed on our cottage floor and I reached for my phone to call an ambulance, I had no idea that the real emergency wouldn't be her breathing, but a neighbor who decided the trash bags and spite mattered more than a human life. And I promise you, this story only gets darker, slower, and more unsettling the further it goes. Because this isn't just about rage, it's about patience, land, silence, and the kind of revenge that grows like ivy and tightens when you least expect it. And it all began on a morning that should have been peaceful, the kind of morning people dream about when they imagine cottagecore living. The sun filtering through lace curtains, bees humming lazily near the lavender patch, the kettle singing softly on the old iron stove, my wife barefoot on the wooden floor humming a tune she'd half forgotten from childhood, our life tucked away at the edge of a small private community where cottages curved around a pond and a narrow wooden bridge arched over a slow reed-choked creek, a bridge we all shared and maintained, or so we were told. And for years, our days were stitched together with routines that felt older than time itself. Baking bread, tending herbs, repairing fences by hand, evenings spent reading aloud while rain tapped the roof like polite applause. And in all that time, there was only one discordant note: the HOA president, a woman everyone called Karen, not behind her back but to her face, because she embraced it like a badge of honor. A woman who believed rules were more important than mercy, that aesthetics mattered more than people, that control was the same thing as community. And she had been circling us for years like a hawk, leaving passive-aggressive notes about the unauthorized wildflower growth near our fence, about the non-compliant hand-painted mailbox, about the way our firewood was stacked in a way she claimed offended the visual harmony of the neighborhood. And we smiled, we nodded, we said we'd look into it, because that's what peaceful people do. And then came the morning my wife gasped, a sharp, panicked sound that cut through the calm like a knife through linen. She dropped her mug, ceramic shattering on the floor, and she folded inward, hands clutching her chest, her face draining of color so fast it scared me more than any scream could. And I was on my knees beside her, calling her name, feeling the fragility of her body, the way her breath stuttered like a candle in wind. And I called emergency services with shaking hands, my voice cracking as I gave the address. The dispatcher calm and steady, telling me to unlock the door, to keep her awake, to watch her breathing. And then came the sentence that changed everything. We're dispatching an ambulance now. And relief washed over me, thin and fragile, but real, until I heard her add, "Be advised, sir, access may be delayed if the bridge is obstructed." And my stomach dropped because I already knew what she meant. Because just 2 days earlier, Karen had posted a notice on the community board about temporary bridge restrictions due to unauthorized use, which was her way of saying she didn't like the delivery drivers and visiting family used it without her approval. And I ran outside, heart pounding, boots half-laced, and what I saw made my vision blur with rage and disbelief. The bridge was blocked, not by fallen trees or an accident, but by piles of black trash bags, old furniture, broken planters, and a hand-painted sign zip-tied to the railing that read, "Bridge closed for community safety." And standing there, hands on her hips like a queen surveying conquered land, was Karen, her face tight with self-satisfaction. And I shouted her name, my voice raw, telling her my wife was dying, that an ambulance was on the way. And she tilted her head, lips pursed, and said in that syrupy, condescending tone she loved, "I followed proper procedure. This bridge is under review. Rules are rules." And something inside me snapped. But not in the way you might expect, because I didn't touch her, I didn't scream any louder, I didn't call the police, because in that moment I realized something chillingly clear. Authorities would take time, paperwork would be filed, excuses would be made, and my wife didn't have time.
So I did what years of quiet living had taught me to do. I worked with my hands. I moved with purpose. I dragged the trash aside with a strength born of terror, splinters biting into my palms, ignoring Karen's shrill protests about liability and fines, clearing just enough space for the ambulance to cross. And when the siren finally cut through the air like a prayer answered too late, I watched paramedics rush in, their boots thudding across the bridge, their faces professional but urgent. And as they took my wife away, her hand slipping from mine, I looked back at Karen, who was already dialing her phone, no doubt reporting my violation. And I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. My wife survived, but barely. Days in the hospital, machines humming, doctors speaking in cautious tones. And in that sterile room smelling of antiseptic, as I held her hand and listened to her breathing even out, I made a promise, not out loud, but deep inside, a promise rooted in the same soil that grew our herbs and wildflowers, that I would protect our life, our peace, and our land. And if Karen thought rules made her powerful, she was about to learn what patience could do. Because cottagecore living teaches you something most people forget, that time is a tool, that nature remembers, and that revenge doesn't have to be loud to be devastating. So I went home and I waited. I tended the garden. I fixed the bridge planks Karen claimed were unsafe. I smiled at meetings. I apologized for my outburst. And I listened, because people like Karen talk when they think they're winning. And she talked about bylaws, about fines, about how she'd finally teach us a lesson. And all the while, I documented everything, not for the authorities, but for myself. I learned the land better than she ever had, learned how water moved under the bridge during heavy rain, how the creek swelled and shrank, how the soil softened in spring. And then one autumn, when leaves piled thick and golden and the air smelled of apples and wood smoke, Karen announced a new rule. No personal decorations on shared spaces, including the bridge. And she ordered everyone to remove anything they'd placed there, including the small carved wooden hearts my wife had hung years ago, hearts that had become a quiet symbol of the community. And when I took them down, slowly, carefully, Karen smiled like she'd won. But what she didn't know was that in removing them, she'd exposed the untreated wood beneath, wood she had neglected for years. And when the rains came, heavy and relentless, the bridge began to sag, not collapse, just enough to be concerning. And Karen, terrified of liability, closed it again, this time with official notices and chains, forcing everyone to use the longer, rougher access road. And that's when the murmurs started. Neighbors frustrated, deliveries delayed, emergency access compromised. And Karen blamed non-compliant residents, but she couldn't name names because she'd followed her own rules. And I watched as her control tightened around her like a noose, because the community she'd tried to dominate was slowly turning against her, not through rebellion, but through quiet withdrawal. People stopped attending meetings, stopped volunteering, stopped caring about her edicts. And then winter came, harsh and beautiful, snow frosting the cottages like gingerbread houses. And one night, during a storm, Karen's power went out, her phone died, and she slipped on her own icy steps, alone, calling for help that didn't come quickly because the bridge was still closed. And when she finally recovered, something in her changed, not enough to apologize, but enough to fear. And in spring, when my wife returned home, weaker but alive, we replanted the wildflowers, this time along the long access road everyone now used, transforming it into a ribbon of color and life. And the community followed, planting, decorating, reclaiming the space Karen tried to control. And when she tried to fine us, no one paid. When she tried to enforce rules, no one listened. And eventually, quietly, without a single dramatic confrontation, Karen resigned, citing health reasons, moving to a place where rules mattered more than roots. And the bridge reopened, stronger than before, reinforced by hands that cared, not by mandates. And sometimes when I walk across it with my wife, her hand warm in mine, we pause and listen to the creek, to the birds, to the wind in the reeds. And I think about that day, about how close I came to losing everything, and how revenge didn't come in a shout or a courtroom, but in patience, in community, in letting someone's own rigidity undo them. And if there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: Peace is not weakness, and sometimes the most powerful response is to grow so deeply rooted that those who try to block your path only end up isolating themselves, because life, like that bridge, is meant to be shared, not controlled, and it will always find a way through.
When my wife finally came home, the cottage felt different, like a body relearning how to breathe after illness, every room holding its breath with us, the floors creaking softer, the walls warmer somehow. And I moved through the days quietly, cooking soups thick with herbs we'd dried last summer, keeping the fire low and steady, helping her sit by the window where the light fell gently instead of harsh. And every morning I walked the land before she woke, checking the soil, the fences, the creek, and most of all, the bridge, because even though it stood open again, I no longer trusted it the way I once had. Trust being one of those things that doesn't return all at once, but in fragments, like frost melting from grass. And Karen noticed. Of course she did. She noticed everything that didn't belong to her, and she began appearing more often near our boundary. Clipboard tucked under her arm, heels sinking into dirt she hated, eyes scanning for violations. But now there was something new behind them, something tight and restless, because she could feel control slipping. Not in a dramatic way, not yet, but in the subtle ways that frightened her more. Neighbors lingering longer in conversation without her, meetings growing quieter, her words landing with dull thuds instead of authority. And I watched all of it the way you watch weather change, not interfering, just noting patterns, because cottage living teaches you that rushing ruins things, whether it's bread or revenge. Spring stretched itself slowly across the land, green returning inch by inch, the creek swelling with snowmelt, murmuring louder at night. And that's when I began the second part of my work. Not obvious, not loud, but deeply rooted. I started inviting neighbors over again, not for meetings, not for planning, just for tea, for fresh bread, for evenings by the fire pit where stories came easier than complaints. And we talked about gardens, about repairs, about the bridge, always the bridge, because it was the heart of our little world. And I never blamed Karen directly. I didn't have to. I simply asked questions, gentle ones, the kind that lingered after you went home, like, isn't it strange how something meant for safety caused so much danger? Or, do you remember when the bridge felt like it belonged to all of us? And people nodded, and memories did the rest, because resentment grows faster when it thinks it's your own idea. And Karen, sensing this shift, doubled down, issuing more notices, more rules, more laminated warnings posted on trees and fences like ugly scars, each one pushing people further away. And still, I waited. The creek did its quiet work too, water slipping around stones, softening soil, carrying away what wasn't anchored. And one afternoon, after a long rain, I noticed the far bank had shifted slightly near Karen's property. Not enough to alarm anyone, just enough to matter later. And I filed that knowledge away, like a seed planted deep. Because revenge in a cottagecore world isn't about striking, it's about letting things grow exactly where they're meant to. And Karen's pride was the most fertile soil I'd ever seen. Summer arrived warm and heavy, lavender buzzing with bees. My wife stronger now, laughing again, though sometimes she'd pause mid-breath and squeeze my hand without knowing why. And I'd squeeze back, because trauma doesn't leave when danger does. It just learns to hide better. And Karen chose that summer to host what she called a community compliance day, a mandatory inspection disguised as a picnic, complete with banners and checklists. And I knew then that the final act was near, because she was desperate for a public show of authority, and desperation makes people careless. She insisted the bridge be decorated for the event, ironically enough, to restore community spirit, and she ordered temporary planters placed along its sides, large, heavy things filled with wet soil, placed without thought for balance or weight distribution. And I watched silently as volunteers followed her instructions, because sometimes the best revenge is letting someone finish their own mistake. The day of the event dawned bright and still, cicadas humming, the air thick with anticipation and heat, neighbors gathering with forced smiles, Karen standing at the center like a general reviewing troops, her voice sharp, her laughter brittle. And my wife and I stood together near the back,
the fingers intertwined, the bridge creaking softly under the unfamiliar strain. And when Karen stepped onto it to give her speech about rules and order and safety, I felt the moment settle into place like the final piece of a quilt. Not dramatic, not sudden, just inevitable. The creek below swollen from last night's rain, the softened bank giving way inch by inch, and then came the sound. Not a crack, but a low wooden groan, the kind you hear before a tree falls, and people gasped, stepping back as the bridge dipped sharply to one side, planters sliding, soil spilling like dark blood, Karen stumbling, shrieking, clutching the railing as her clipboard flew into the water. And no one was hurt, not truly, but the image was enough, the symbol undeniable, the bridge she claimed to protect nearly failing under her own excess. And the crowd fell silent, not with fear, but with understanding, and Karen's face, pale and furious and humiliated, told me she knew it too. After that, everything unraveled quickly, not because I pushed, but because nothing was holding it together anymore. People demanded repairs done properly, transparently, together. Karen argued, blamed weather, blamed volunteers, blamed everyone but herself, but her words rang hollow now, echoing uselessly against a truth everyone had felt beneath their feet. And over the following weeks, committees formed without her, repairs were planned without her input, meetings happened in living rooms instead of under her banners. And she tried to fight it, of course she did, sent letters, threatened fines, but they were unanswered, unread, tossed into recycling bins like autumn leaves. And the final blow came quietly, the way the most permanent things do, when she arrived one morning to find the community board empty, notices removed, her authority stripped not by force but by irrelevance. And within a month, her house stood dark, curtains drawn, a for sale sign leaning crookedly in the yard. And when the moving truck crossed the bridge for the last time, reinforced now by hands that cared, I stood with my wife and watched, not with triumph, but with release. Life settled back into its rhythms after that, slower, kinder. The bridge repaired not just structurally, but spiritually, decorated again with small wooden hearts, hand-carved, each one placed by a different family. And my wife returned fully to herself, planting again, singing again, her laughter threading through the cottage like sunlight. And sometimes late at night we'd sit by the fire and talk about that day, about fear, about anger, about how close we came to losing everything. And I'd tell her the truth, that revenge didn't feel like victory, it felt like balance restored, like water finding its level. And when I walk the bridge now, feeling the solid planks beneath my feet, hearing the creek whisper below, I understand something I didn't before, that community isn't built by rules or fear, but by shared responsibility, by care, by knowing when to stand firm and when to let go. And if this story leaves you with anything, let it be this, that quiet lives are not weak lives, that gentleness can coexist with strength, and that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to let someone else decide what kind of world you're allowed to live in. Because when you tend your land, your love, and your patience long enough, those who try to block your path will eventually find themselves standing alone on unstable ground, while you keep walking forward, together.